Robert Kennedy was basically a U.S. senator from New York, actually, and he was the brother of President John F. Kennedy. And he was basically assassinated in 1968 while he was basically seeking the Democratic presidential nomination. So he was in the midst of primaries, actually. And after he won the primaries in California, he basically gave a victory speech in a hotel in Los Angeles when Sirhan Sirhan basically shot him and killed him. He wounded some additional people. And the main motivation was probably the strong support of Kennedy of Israel and Israeli interests, and his support for basically improving the relations between the two countries and really enhancing the alliance between Israel and the U.S. Sirhan Sirhan was a Jordanian from a Palestinian origin. He was a Palestinian refugee that was his family moved to Jordan, and eventually he moved to the U.S. So again, that was mainly an action of protest against the growing or the increasing positive relationship between Israel and the U.S.
And he was originally sentenced to death. That's correct.
That is correct. Eventually, when California basically canceled the death penalty, basically his sentence was commuted to life in prison with parole. So basically, there was always the option that at some point in the future, he may be released.
So he's applied for parole many times before. What do you think persuaded the parole board this time?
So I think there were several factors. First of all, I think it's a cultural change within the Department of Justice, which also eventually impacted the California DA that in the first time, after 16 parole hearings, for the first time, basically, they didn't object the release of Sirhan Sirhan. And that's basically a change in policy of trying to take a more, I guess, conciliatory approach towards especially offenders who were youth offenders. Sirhan Sirhan was fairly young. He was a young adult. He was 24 years old. And I think there's a growing sense in DOJ that in order to ensure rehabilitations and return to society of those prisoners, we need to adopt a much more conciliatory approach, much more soft approach, and really focus more on recovery rehabilitations. Also, it was very clear for them that there's a very low likelihood that he will reoffend. He also expressed remorse, and he also indicated that he is not as engaged anymore with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there were no concerns about him maybe engaging in future acts of violence. And he's 77 years old, so he also qualified for what we call an elderly parole. Basically, anyone who served more than 20 years in prison and is above the age of 50 get further consideration through this specific criteria.
So being granted parole is not the end game here. What is the process from here?
So basically, a review panel of 2 parole officers basically recommended releasing him. Right now, the ball moves to the governor, Gavin Newsom, who is actually now facing some challenge for his governorship, and he will need to make the final decision. We know that some members of the Kennedy family, especially the sons of Robert Kennedy, are putting some pressure, both public pressure, but I'm guessing also some political pressure in order to prevent his release. They're arguing that political assassination is a very unique crime and the response needs to be more harsh. They also arguing that that may encourage use of violence in the future. And they also mentioned the fact that he was initially sentenced to death. So in many ways, his punishment was already reduced. So, there's no reason to do it again.
Yeah. And of course, we know the Kennedy family has a lot of clout, so it might sway the governor's decision, as you say, who's in a political tight spot at the moment. What do you think more broadly Americans would think about him being released?
That's a good question. First of all, it's important to remember that this is something that happened more than 50 years ago. So, there's several generations of Americans that are not really educated, aware, familiar with this act. Nonetheless, as you mentioned, I think the Kennedy family is still being held in some kind of she still has a mythical aura in American society and the tragedy that this family went through, not just with John JFK and RFK, but also Ted Kennedy, he's passing away as someone who was one of the main leaders in the Senate. All that provides the family significant clout. And I think eventually there's significant sympathy towards the family, not just in the Northeast, not just in Massachusetts, in the US, especially in the Democratic circles. And Gavin Newsom, the governor, needs any help he can get right now as he's really fighting the recall. So, you know, my strong sense is that it won't go smooth. I'm skeptic he eventually will release him, but I guess we'll need to wait and see.
Yeah, maybe not right immediately. Arie, really appreciate your time and going through that case with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for hosting me.